So I just want to understand, what is it about Arabs and Muslims that makes them so inclined to terrorism? Is it their culture? Do they just have a death culture that praises death? Or is it their religion? Maybe they have a violent religion that has rules that encourage people to commit acts of violence against innocents. Or is it maybe their genetics? Is it possible that their DNA is just so violent? Like if you zoom in with a microscope, you'll see that their atoms are vibrating maybe at a higher frequency than everyone else. Oh, maybe it's the hot weather. I think it's maybe the hot weather, because if you've ever experienced the heat and you're in the desert and your sugar levels drop and you just want to fuck other people up because the sun. I blame the sun. All right, today we are going to be talking about some controversial shit. We're going to be talking about why you think Arabs are terrorists and why you think Muslims are terrorists. This is a heavy one. Strap in, put your seatbelts on, because we're going to go over a lot of dense material that is going to get to the bottom of why everyone believes that Arabs and Muslims are associated with terrorism. In this episode specifically, when I use the word you, I'm not referring to you personally. I'm referring to the general you that includes me and you and every other human. So please, if I say anything with you in it that seems like I'm targeting you, I'm not. I'm just saying people in general. First order of business, let's do some guided meditation. Imagine a terrorist standing, holding a rifle, and wearing a suicide vest. What do you imagine? What was it that you imagined? If you imagined a brown man with a beard, wearing a turban maybe, then you need to watch the rest of this video, because we gotta resolve the trauma. We gotta undo the brainwashing that has taken place. So before we talk about terrorists, we gotta define what terrorism is. Terrorism is using violence or intimidation against unarmed civilians with the goal of achieving political aims. That is the textbook definition. In layman terms, it's doing horrible shit to innocent people in order to gain some kind of power. So what is that word? What actually is the origin of that word? I think that word lately has been abused by the media and by people and by anyone who wants to get a point across, and by politicians. It's just used left and right. So let's get to the bottom of who actually invented that word and when was the first time it was used before it was actually so all over the place. In 1795, to describe the French Revolution and what they were doing to the people, they did some pretty terrible shit. Excuse my French. And in French, they called it La Terreur, the reign of terror. This is when Edmund Burke converted it from French to English. And this is how the word terrorism came to be, 1795. So it's a pretty modern phrase. It's a pretty modern word. So who actually were the world's first terrorists, or the organizations that were first associated with terrorism? Obviously, the French Revolution, whom the word was created after. And we have the Russian Empire. We have the American white supremacists. And we have the European anarchists. So these were actually the first people to be called terrorists. So terrorism originated in Europe and circulated amongst European movements for quite a while before it made its turn to the Middle East, where it currently resides and where Middle Easterns excel the most, apparently. So what is it really about Arabs and Muslims or Middle Easterns that makes them inclined to terrorism? Because we want to get to the bottom of why you think they're terrorists, or why the world thinks they're terrorists, and if they actually are. And if they are, then what are the reasons? And if they aren't, then what are the reasons we believe they are? So let's talk about the Arab representation, or the Middle Eastern representation, or the brown person's representation in general in Western media. So if you watch movies, if the movie takes place in the Middle East, or if there are any Middle Easterns in the movie, you will notice some patterns. So if you watch movies where there's like an evil guy, the big villain, and he does this big gathering where all the evil people show up, you will always notice one thing. You will always see the one or two Arab dudes who attend that villain's meeting with full Arab traditional wear. Obviously, Arabs don't all wear the same thing, but they'll always portray someone who's wearing something like this red and white scarf, and either the white or the black garment on their body. You'll never really see them do or say anything. They'll just kind of be like background characters, but they're very clear because amongst all the other characters who are indistinguishable from each other, there's always the Arab guy that is very, very noticeable. So this is not really a problem that is specific to Arabs, Muslims, Middle Easterns. This is actually, there's a lot of misrepresentation when it comes to minorities in general in the Western media. Black people, for example, have been misrepresented and making them seem like they're thugs or gangsters or criminals. Latinos have been misrepresented looking like drug lords and people who sell drugs and drug pins and everything related to drugs. And Arabs have been designated the terrorist role in these movies. But in my opinion, the misrepresentation of Arabs in movies has actually caused the most tangible and real life damage that any people have ever experienced because of media. And I'll tell you why in a second. But you always see in movies, if there is a movie that takes place in the Middle East, or actually in any third world country, you'll see that the place is always so chaotic and primitive and dirty and nasty, and people just look so messy and uneducated and all over the place. There's always that vibe you get whenever the movie transitions to a scene in a third world country. And we're talking about the Middle East here, so I'll just continue talking about the Middle East, but it's pretty much representative of how every other minority is represented. Whenever the scene cuts to something in the Middle East, it's always noise and people walking around in absolute disarray, and they're dirty, they're messy. The country, or it's not even a country, it looks like something from the first century, and there's no technology or scientific advancement or engineering, nothing whatsoever that we associate with modern day civilization. Like, the movie jumped back 2,000 years, even though the movie takes place now. So the movie will say Cairo 2024, and it looks like they jumped back in time 2,000 years. And obviously the main character, who's most definitely a white guy, is always so sophisticated compared to the rest of the monkeys that are surrounding him. And they'll always show that the Middle Eastern person is so dumb and unaware and unintelligent, unsophisticated. They're just like primitive, like a bunch of cavemen walking around. And I'm pretty sure that cavemen were smart, but they represent these Middle Easterns like they're fucking monkeys. So this is one thing. Another thing is that the Arabs are always background characters. You don't really get to see them talk. You don't get to see them act or plan or do something that an intelligent person would do. But another thing is that even if you do get to see them as a main character or an assisting character, they're always so fucking stupid. The main character always so easily outsmarts them. And I get that the main character outsmarts everyone. But when there is a British villain or a Russian villain or any other villain, they're always very intelligent and their plots are very smart and they give the main character a very hard time. But the Middle Eastern villains, they're the dumbest fucking villains. Like, if you watch any movie where there's an Arab guy who's supposed to be the evil guy, oh my God, it's hilarious. It's comical how bad they are at being bad. So I mentioned that you don't actually get to see Arabs talk, and that portrays that they're unintelligent or they don't communicate or whatever. But you actually get to see them yell in gibberish all the time. I've never actually heard a movie where there is supposed to be Arabic speaking people that are actually speaking Arabic. It's always like, this is what it always sounds like. And this is what it always actually is. And it always bothers me. Like, you spent $100 million on this movie. That was your budget. And you couldn't get one Arabic speaking person to tell you if the was actually Arabic? Come on. Oh, and also, whenever there's people walking in the market, because there's nothing else in the Middle East but markets. Anyway, people are walking in the markets, and then obviously the main guy starts killing people and blowing shit up. These guys always die in the explosions or whatever, like it doesn't fucking matter, like it's nobody's business. They're just dying left and right like it's nobody's business. They're always just represented in that manner. And that is the stepping stone and the pedestal on which Arabs, Middle Easterns, and Muslims are dehumanized and terrorized. Well, not terrorized as if someone is terrorizing them, but they are being associated with terrorism, dumbness, uncivilized, unsophisticated, primitive, and good for nothing. Another thing regarding the Hollywood representation of Middle Easterns is that most of the times when there is a Middle Eastern role to be played, it's actually not played by a Middle Eastern. It's usually, for whatever fucking reason, it's usually played by someone who is of Indian descent or of an Indian background. And you could tell, and I actually acted in a movie, a short film, and I was playing the main character who was supposed to be a Middle Eastern guy. And then his mother was played by an Indian lady. And I don't think that the world lacks Middle Eastern actors. They're out there. And I think I know why. I think it's because we've been brainwashed to think that anyone who's brown can represent anyone else who's brown. And so if you have a certain skin complexion, I guess you could play whatever role. Like if you're Egyptian, I guess you could play Moroccan. Or if you're Indian, I guess you could play Saudi. Like it doesn't work that way. As I explained, they're not the same people. So you can't get people who just share a skin color and expect them to have the culture and the background and the experiences and the language or the dialect. Like it doesn't work that way. Because when you hire people who are actually from that background, they will enhance your outcome, your movie or your end result or your end product, whatever it is. They are going to enhance it with their input because they can then see if something was wrong. They're like, oh, wait, actually, in Egypt, they don't use this musical instrument. They use that, you know? So it could be as simple as this, as simple as the accent. Representation is so important. So we can't just go around hiring anyone who has the same amount of melanin in their skin and assume that they could fit in those roles. So this is just another thing. It's very important and it's very apparent in the hiring decisions that even those people who seem successful and educated have been successfully brainwashed. And I wouldn't call it brainwashing. I would call it brain toxification. And it's obvious in these hiring roles. And most people, because they're unaware or uneducated on the subject matter, they won't even notice when an Indian person is hired to do let's say, a Tunisian person's role. Most people won't even realize. And that's how the cycle continues. So we need to educate ourselves on these things. And I'm not expecting everyone to be entirely aware of these things because obviously a lot of it happens with the upbringing and your environment and your childhood. But at the very least, the overall categories maybe could help. I don't know. I'm just saying. It's fucked up. So this is Hollywood. Another aspect of it is when you read the news or you listen to the news, you will always see. This has been proven time and time again. You will always see or hear if there is any kind of crime where the suspect is of Middle Eastern descent, an Arab or a Muslim in any way, shape, or form, they will always tie the crime to terrorism. The word terrorism itself, they'll always tie it to it. So obviously, the crime is horrible and evil, but they will always tie it to the word terrorism. On the other hand, if you have a white person, an American maybe, or a European committing a crime, or actually, for that matter, anyone else that is not brown, basically, commits a crime, they're still going to call it for what it is. It's an evil, heinous, whatever, but they will never say the word terrorism. So the word terrorism apparently has been reserved for people of Middle Eastern descent or people that are brown or people that are Muslims. And this is the other aspect of how we have all been sort of brainwashed to believe that terrorism is somehow related to Middle Easterns and Middle Easterns are somehow related to terrorism. So let's actually draw some lines to further clarify Arabs and Muslims. Arabs and Muslims are not the same thing, all right? Arabs are Arabs, and it's related to the language and the region. And Muslims are Muslims. It's related to the religion, Islam, and the followers who believe in that religion. So they're completely separate things. You could have an Arab Muslim, but you could also have an Arab Christian or an Arab Jew or an Arab insert religion here. They could also be atheists or agnostic. Like, that exists. They're normal people like you and I, and they have their own beliefs. Not everyone is born into a religion and stays with that religion. Like, yes, predominantly, most people in that area are religious. Just like the US, most people are religious. Just like anywhere in the world, like, most people are religious or believe in a certain religion or ideology. But a lot of people also are atheists and agnostic, like myself, for example. And in these areas, like the Middle East, that have been so misrepresented to make you believe that everyone there is like an extreme Muslim, a radical Muslim, not the case. There's Christians, Jews, and there's many religions that if I say now, you wouldn't even know. And there's also agnostics and atheists. So keep that in mind, because they're people that could actually use their brains and make decisions. They're not people who are born and indoctrinated into a belief and then end up with a rifle and going to fight the infidels, you know? And you could have a Korean Muslim or an American Muslim or an Arab Muslim or a Nigerian Muslim. So Arabs and Muslims, not the same thing, although they could overlap. Obviously, Islam is the predominant religion in the area. However, these two need to be separated from each other because they are not the same thing and they are not associated with each other whatsoever. So what I always wonder is it Arabs that are terrorists or Muslims that are terrorists? Or is it people who are within a specific range of melanin in their body? I'm not sure. I'm not sure what it is. Like, can a Korean Muslim be a terrorist? Or can an Arab Christian be a terrorist? Where do we draw the lines? The word terrorism has just been so loosely associated with the entire region, or that falls under an umbrella term. And that's why it's so ambiguous and it's so difficult to dissociate the two, because we've just been hammered with this information time and time again through the traditional media and through news and through Hollywood, and it's just very difficult to escape that brainwashing. So let's talk about why terrorism actually happens. So terrorism is obviously a symptom of extremism and radicalism, and anyone who becomes extreme or radical in a specific belief, regardless of what it is. So that could be religious, spiritual, political, financial. It doesn't matter what it is. If they become radicalized and extreme, it is very easy for them to resort to violence in order to make their belief the prevalent belief or the dominant controlling power in the system that they're in. This is not specific to Islam or Arabs. You have radicalism and extremism all over the world. White supremacists, Zionism, radical Islam. You have Nazis. You have the Buddhist nationalists. Yeah, that's actually true. I know Buddhism is supposed to be all about peace and oneness with nature or whatever, but there's actually Buddhist extremists. And if Buddhists can become extremists, then maybe the belief is not the problem, and it's the human mind and the desire for power that's actually the problem. So maybe it's not the religion or the people or the genetics. Maybe it's just humans in general and their desire for power that actually leads to radicalization and extremification of beliefs that leads to violence. So if you go to the CIA's website or any counterterrorism website, you will find that all of the terrorist groups are under the banner of Islam, and a lot of them are also Arabs. And if you also look at state sponsors of terrorism, you will find that they're also mostly Muslim countries, although I think Cuba and North Korea are the only two on there that are not Muslim or Arab. So my question is, how is it possible that people in that region are the only people in the world that commit acts of terrorism? How is it possible? Is it possible, and how is it possible? I'm not saying that these groups are not terrorists. Of course they are. But I'm saying, how is it possible that they're the only terrorists? Across the globe, they're only in that region. Come on, really? Okay. So you're trying to tell me that European countries have not funded proxy wars, or European countries have not funded terrorism or acts of terrorism in order to achieve certain political gains? Whoever is writing those lists is obviously not going to put themselves on the list. Regardless of how much you've done or how much you fit the bill, you're never going to put yourself on the list. That's one thing to keep in mind, because these lists are extremely biased, because the people writing it and their allies are never going to actually end up in it. So we want to dehumanize the people there as much as possible. And we want to show that it is in our benefit to destroy these places because they pose a direct threat to us. And obviously, you cannot do that unless you generalize, because if you get too specific, then people get lost in the details. So you have to put an umbrella term over an entire people and claim that they all fall under the same banner. So obviously, countries of European descent are exempt from being terrorists, or from being state sponsors of terrorists, or from committing acts of terrorism, or being associated with it whatsoever, God forbid. So even though the United States Army alone in 2003 went to Iraq and killed over 1 million people just in that one country, just in that one war, and that's just the US Army, 1 million people, which is more than double what all of the terrorist organizations have killed since 2003. But we can't call the US Army a terrorist organization, can we? So obviously, there's some bias here, to say the very least. And there's certain people or certain groups who are exempt from being called terrorists. Apparently, the word terrorist now has nothing to do with the actual act and everything to do with who is committing the act. And this is just me talking about the killing. They've killed 1 million people, let alone the destruction they caused, and the people they tortured, the people they kidnapped, the resources that they stole, and the polarization of people that they created, inciting hate, creating radicalism, arming these radical groups and turning them against each other, essentially funding civil wars and creating proxy wars, destabilizing the entire region and destroying their economies and ruining the lives and futures of hundreds of millions of people. That is not terrorism, right? Okay. Okay. Now, obviously, it's no secret that in Middle Eastern countries and in most third world countries, the governments are extremely corrupt. They are what you call maybe an autocracy. It's usually people that took over by force, most likely someone from the military who took over, and they are extreme dictators. It's initiated by the circumstances that these countries went through and all of the conflicts that they had to endure, and it's a result of that violence. However, a lot of these people are usually put in power by foreign countries where they will assist one group versus the other, help them take over, and then pretend that it's now a democracy. But these people are usually loyal to some foreign government and they don't really care about their people, which then continues the cycle of violence. It continues the cycle of poverty, the impediment of freedom of speech, and it's a horrible cycle that enables poverty and violence to continue. Another thing is that if any of these third world countries, or what they call developing countries, or if any of their leaders decide to kind of take a new path or go against the Western powers or the dominant world powers, they are often met with a lot of resistance. If anyone is actually attempting to build their country up, whether that be in military power or in technological advancements or any kind of independence from the Western powers, they are usually met with a lot of resistance. And that resistance will come in the form of sanctions. It could come in the form of all-out wars. These two things impair countries from making progress. And obviously, with these totalitarian regimes, progress is very unlikely. But if it were the case where these countries are actually trying to make legitimate progress, a lot of the times it is hindered by these other powerful countries who the progress will not necessarily be in their benefit. And so because of that, there's always pushback. So my wife is from Iraq, or as you say it in Arabic, Iraq. So we live here in the US, and every time she meets someone from the US, or a lot of the times she meets someone from the US, and she says, "Oh yeah, I'm from Iraq," if they have served in the military, the first thing they say is, "Oh yeah, I served in Iraq," or "I did 2 tours in Iraq." Do you realize what you're saying as a US Army soldier or whatever? You realize that you going to Iraq is essentially you being a terrorist abroad, somewhere else. Like, the only reason you're actually having this conversation, the only reason we're here is because you and people like you who participated in that war caused so much damage and ruined so many lives and destabilized the nations. And so that people like our parents found that life there was unbearable. There was no opportunities. There was no room for growth. There was no safety. There was danger. And so because there is no future, our parents had to leave and come to the very place that was the main reason in all of their troubles. So when you say, oh, I served in Iraq, you realize it's the equivalent of someone coming to the US and then telling you, I was with ISIS. It's the same fucking thing. Don't tell people from Iraq that you served in Iraq, or people from Vietnam that your grandfather served in Vietnam, or people from Afghanistan that your father served in Afghanistan or you served in Afghanistan. Like, it's not something to brag about. If anything, you should apologize about serving, right? You're just very used to people in the US. They see you in the uniform and they're like, thank you for your service. No. What service? Maybe for them, they think you actually served the purpose, but you didn't. You just destroyed or participated in destroying everyone's lives and futures. When I say I think the US Army is a terrorist organization, I don't say that to say that any person in the US Army is by default a bad person. That's not what I mean. What I mean is, in the US, there's a lot of people that go to the army because they want to get a student loan, or because they think they're going to have a better life in the future. And so they think, I'm going to do my part and then it's going to set me up for life. Obviously, a lot of the times this is completely false, and most people who go to the military actually, once they've come back from their service, they end up suffering and struggling. However, this is not to say that these people are bad, but they did commit acts of terrorism. Once you're deployed in another country and you're engaging in active conflict, even if you're not engaging in active conflict, you are partaking in terrorism. You are partaking in destroying people's lives. However, this is not to say that they're entirely bad people. But when these people come back and they know they've done terrible shit, they know. And you can see that in how many people that come back that have PTSD, because these people do some horrendous things abroad and they come back and their psyche can't handle it anymore. If they're not entire psychopaths, which most of them are not, most of them are decent people, but they do some horrible shit overseas. And when they come back, a lot of them are suffering from PTSD. But it bothers me because you went abroad, destroyed all of these people's lives, and you come back and you're the one that has mental health issues now. So you suffer from PTSD. Like, I'm sorry, did killing all these children make you feel mentally insane? So what about the people that are suffering over there? What about the people who have lost their children and their homes and their money and their lives and their futures? What about these people? What about the people who had to leave their families behind so they can find better lives elsewhere? What happens to these people? But you are now coming back and you have PTSD. Like, I'm sorry, the human in me wants to empathize and wants to sympathize with the emotional capacity of these people. But I simply can't, knowing everything that led to that point. Because the real victims here are not the soldiers that come back with PTSD. The real victims here are the people whose lives were entirely destroyed by these soldiers who came back and then had PTSD. So I would like to sympathize, but I really can't find it in me to shift my focus from the real victims to the people who imposed these circumstances on them. And I just have to bring up the classic Middle Eastern or Muslim women are oppressed. They're not. Just like any culture, there is roles that are played in society. And as time goes by, these traditions and these cultures and these roles change. Just like in the US after the Industrial Revolution and after World War I, the woman's role changed in society. These things happen based on circumstances. The same happens in the Middle East. Women are extremely independent. And if you look at their culture 100 years ago versus now, it's very different. A lot of it is because of westernization, obviously because of the Western media influence on the region, but also a huge part of it, most of it, is because people's mentalities change as time goes by. And as the circumstances changes, the needs change and the behaviors and the resulting traditions and cultures from these behaviors change. So this is something that exists in the Middle East, where the woman is actually allowed to drive, is actually allowed to work, is allowed to have an opinion. The woman is allowed to speak up against abuse or mistreatment, if it ever happens. So this idea that we've all been fed that Middle Eastern women are oppressed because they wear the thing on their head. My mom wears the thing on her head. Oh my God, is it possible that you know more about my mom than I do? No, she's not oppressed. And most women aren't. They do it by choice. They do it out of a religious, spiritual belief. And that's what they want to do. Also use it as a fashion statement. You'll see a lot of women who are dressed in the Islamic wear, and it looks very, very fashionable. So this idea that the Middle Eastern woman is oppressed and we need to free the women, and so let's go and bomb these countries so we can free their women, that's not how it works, because they don't need to be free. Like our dear friend J. Cole said, she don't want to be saved, don't save her. that's just one of the things that I wanted to talk about, is your understanding of the Middle Eastern culture and the Middle Eastern struggle is most definitely incorrect. And if you wanted to actually find out what that world feels like, then either find friends that are from there or go visit. And not visit for a week and look at people walking in the mall. Actually go there and spend some legitimate amount of time and get to know the people and get to know the culture. And you'll most likely have your mind changed. So now let's actually talk about the reasons behind why there actually is so many terrorist groups in that region. And it's not because the culture, and it's not because the religion, and it's not because the genetics or the weather or the people. It is all related to geopolitics and politics in general. So when you go to a country and you essentially completely destroy its foundation and completely destroy the fabric of society, and then create multiple different groups that are all fighting for power, and you talk with this one and you tell them, I'm going to support you, and you talk to that one and you tell them, I'm going to support you, and I'm going to support you, and you turn them all against each other, and then you give them all weapons and you just let them have at it, you basically created the terrorism. And not only that, but you funded it and you armed it, and you are making sure that it stays there, because that's the only way to keep these places under, so that you could still have control over them. And the means by which you keep these people under is you polarize them, you create a sense of unsafety, you destroy the economy, you destroy the education system so people are uneducated. Obviously, people are going to talk about, why are we in this situation? And the answer is always going to be, because America. America is going to be the answer. So then obviously you're going to have people that hate America and want death to America. So you create the problem, you plan it, you create it, you execute it, you ensure that it keeps going, and then you ruin their reputation because everyone else is none the wiser and no one knows all this context. And you basically just point and say, look, these people are barbarians. They hate us because we're civilized. They hate us because we're advanced and we have scientific advancements and technologies. And they hate us because they're primitive, barbaric people who live in the desert, in tents, and have no electricity or education. And so without all of this context, it's so easy to look at these people and you say, these are subhumans. And killing them would be an act of mercy for them, so that we could rid them of this miserable life that they're in. And so we can protect ourselves. And that's why so many people think that going abroad and fighting in countries that are not theirs, that pose zero threat to them, they think that when they go there, they're actually protecting their country that's 6,000 miles away somehow. And with all of these things said, with all of the havoc that the Western world has wreaked onto the Middle East, you somehow will still see that Arabs and Middle Easterns love Americans. They love American culture. They love American movies. They love America itself. And the only thing they actually stand against is American policies in the region and the American government's and army's influence on the region, because they realize the damage that has been done by them. But other than that, like these people that you see in movies and in propaganda videos of like a Middle Eastern person burning the US flag, like sure, it exists. Like in the US, if someone burns the holy book, the Quran, or if someone burns whatever, like yes, of course you're gonna find footage of someone doing some crazy extreme shit. But that's not the case. People don't go around burning the US embassy in the Middle East. That's not how it works. People actually love America. Everyone that I've ever met has wanted to visit America, and most of them actually couldn't. Their visas got rejected. And like everyone that I've ever met from the Middle East wants to visit the US, maybe even wants to live in the US. So just know, you have no enemies there. These people are not your enemies. They actually love you. And since they can't visit you, you should go visit them. And maybe when we establish that connection, we'll realize that everything we were ever taught was very incorrect. Another thing that we've seen over time, and I think the first time that I saw it, was these pictures of hungry African babies. And I grew up to the image of the hungry African baby starving. They look anemic and their rib cage is all showing through the skin and their stomachs are so bloated and there's always like a fucking fly on their face and dried boogers on their nose. Like I grew up to these images that really desensitized me. Like they did two things. First of all, they ingrained an image in my head that all Black African countries are struggling and that everyone there is dying from starvation and famine. And the other thing that it did was it desensitized me to feel anything towards these people, because in my mind, I now see them as this is what it is. They are suffering, they are struggling, they are starving. This is their image in my head now. And so, because it's expected, it doesn't really evoke an emotional response in me anymore. And I think in the same manner that happened to Middle Easterns, because when you see them, you always see in the news, if there's anything about Middle Easterns, if it's not about terrorism, it's about how they have wars going on and how they're struggling and how their homes have been demolished, how their children are under the rubble and how they are living now on the streets and they have to rebuild, or the oppression that's going on over there. The image of Middle Easterns has been so tarnished by either portraying them as dumb, portraying them as terrorists, or portraying them as people who have horrible lives. And this desensitized everyone. So now when we see images of what's happening in Palestine or what's happening in Yemen or what's happening in Sudan or any of these countries, it doesn't evoke an emotional response anymore. And for anything to evoke an emotional response, it has to be so extreme. And by the time anything reaches that level of extremity, it is already too late for us to take action. So this is another way that enables countries that are in power to continue abusing and exploiting these nations, because they know that we have been desensitized and we will not take action and we will not speak up because the images that we're seeing simply do not evoke an emotional response. We simply do not care, because as far as we've been told, this is how it's supposed to be for these people. Now, we've been talking about this in a general standpoint as if everyone there fits the bill. But let's actually get specific. If you add up all the terrorist groups and all of their members at their peaks, not even now, at their peak, when they had the most members and they were the most active and the most powerful, if you add all of these members together, they form a 0.00005% of the entire population of that region, of the Middle East and Muslims. If you put all of the terrorists in one group and everyone else in another group, the terrorist group is 0.00005%. So how is it possible that 0.00005% represents the rest of the people? Especially that the rest of the people oppose this very, 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 very small minority. Not only that, they oppose it, but also that the rest of the population are actually the victims of these minorities. Like, who do you think these terrorist groups are actually hunting down and killing? You think they're going out and killing Germans and Italians and Americans? No, they're killing Middle Easterns and Arabs and Muslims. These are the main victims. So how could you possibly put the assailant and the victim in the same group together simply because they share a religion or a nationality or a skin color? Do you see how bizarre that is? And another thing that's worth adding as well is that these terrorist groups, they only actually exist in a handful of countries, 3 or 4 or maybe 5 countries where they're actively engaging in conflict. So 3 or 4 countries out of over 20 countries, so that's like percentage aside, these are 3 or 4 countries in the region. So you're generalizing on 20 countries, on over 20 countries that are vastly different from each other. Vastly different. Let's start small. Arabs are vastly different from each other. They have different dialects. They have different cultures, cuisines, histories, politics. They have different everything. They also have different religions. So you're talking about people who are so different from each other. And if we even go broader and we talk about Muslims, obviously they have completely different languages. Saying all Arabs are the same or Middle Easterns or Muslims are the same is like saying all white people are the same, removing countries from existence and histories and cultures from existence. It's like saying all Asians are the same, all black people are the same. It's such a ridiculous notion to even think of that, let alone say it and believe it. So not only are you generalizing the 0.00005% to the rest of the population, but you're also generalizing 3 or 4 countries to 20 other countries, neighboring countries that have nothing to do with them. It's insane. I don't even know why I'm saying this. It's crazy that I even have to explain this. Here's a piece of information you probably didn't know. In the United States, there is 6 times more white nationalist terrorism than any other terrorist group combined. 6 times more white nationalist terrorism. So these are like white supremacy groups. 6 times as much. And yet, you probably didn't know that. And even worse, if there is a white person who commits a crime, a violent crime, whether that is a gun shooting or a mass shooting or an explosion, they are called a suspect or a gunman, a lone gunman, or an active shooter, right? We've seen these labels across the news. But if it's a brown guy who is the suspect, then it is immediately connected to terrorism somehow. Regardless of who that person is and what their religion is, whether they were American or not, they are always related to terrorism somehow, whether by relating them to a terrorist organization or by calling them a terrorist or by calling the act itself an act of terrorism, versus the other crime committed by a white person would be labeled as a tragedy or a massacre or a shooting, but never related to terrorism. If you take it to examples, the Orlando Pulse Club shooting, which the guy's name was Omar. I don't even know where he was from, but he was a brown guy. They immediately tied him to ISIS, and they immediately called it a terror act or a terrorist attack. I think he killed 49 people. However, if you look at the Las Vegas gun shooting, the guy killed over 60 people, maybe even more. This was a white guy who went to a hotel and gunned people down in a music festival. The act was not called an act of terrorism. I think Trump called it a heinous act or an act of pure evil. So when you say this is an act of pure evil, evil does not have a face. And so when you say this person committed an act of pure evil, it's just that person is evil. But when you take a brown guy and associate him with an entire religion and then associate him to an act, and you create that trifecta of the brown person and the religion and the label terrorism or terrorist, then you have a closed loop where any of these things is synonymous for the other one. And that is very, very, very dangerous. And it has served as the means by which Arabs, Muslims, Middle Easterns, and people of minority in general have been dehumanized and been stereotyped to negative things that have negative connotations. And because of that, if we do anything to hurt these people, we're doing it for the greater good. If we kill their children, we're doing it for the greater good. If we imprison them and torture them, we're doing it for the greater good. And this is what we need to do. This is what we need to do to them in order for the world to be a better place. And it's excusable every single time. It's justified. And the only way it can be justified is by dehumanizing them and giving them terrible labels that excuse any act that we do against them, because anything that we do against them could not possibly be worse than what they have done, are doing, or will do in the future. Another thing that I want to talk about is that there is almost 50 million deaths worldwide every year. Over 92% of these deaths are caused by health issues. And then you have 5.4% that are caused by accidents, either transportation accidents or people drowning or fires or falling down, etc. And then you have 1.3% of these are suicides. 0.7% are homicides. 0.2% are wars, and 0.05% are terrorism. So let's traverse backwards. 24,000 people are killed every year from acts of terrorism. 96,000 people are killed every year from war. And 336,000 are killed by homicide. And then you have 624,000 who are killed by suicide. So you have wars and armed conflicts killing 4 times as many people yearly as acts of terrorism, and 14 times people being killed from homicide and violent crimes than terrorism, and 26 times people being killed by suicide than terrorism. But forget about mental health issues and everything that's causing them. Forget about health issues in general and all the chemicals that we're fucking ingesting and our hideous lifestyle. And forget about violent crimes and hate crimes and poverty. And forget about war profiteering and the people who go around creating proxy wars so they can sell their weapons or have influence in a certain area or steal resources. Forget about all of these things. Let's focus on the 0.05% happening by terrorist groups, and then let's tarnish the reputation of 2 billion people and blame 2 billion people for the 0.05% of deaths worldwide every year. That will definitely be worth it. and it would definitely have a great return on investment. Because if we achieve that goal, we can actually achieve a lot of monetary success and a lot of financial gain to behold from dehumanizing these people, so we could continue to destabilize them and keep them down and do everything that we must do in order to get as much financial, political, and power benefits as we possibly can. Let's keep everyone as uninformed as humanly possible so that everything we do is greenlit by the people who have been brainwashed. So obviously all forms of stereotypes are bad because they lead to real life ramifications and consequences to the people who are misrepresented. In my opinion, Arabs, Muslims, Middle Easterns have had the worst consequences from the misrepresentations. If you go to the Middle East and you see how these countries were and how they are now, and how they have literally been sent back in time thousands of years. Not thousands of years, that's an exaggeration. But these nations and countries and regions have been deprived of technological advancement and in terms of civilization and government and structure and education. So much has been taken from these countries. So much wealth, knowledge, resources, stability, safety. So much power has been taken from these nations. And the state in which they're in now is the state in which they were in maybe 200, 300 years ago, and possibly even worse. Like, it's possible that they are now in the worst time they have ever been throughout history. So it will take a while for all these nations to heal from the foreign interventions and from the hands that are constantly putting pressure on them. Once, hopefully, these dirty, nasty, bloody, greedy hands come out of their honeypot and they can actually get to recuperate from all the damages that were done and grow and become active members in the human society, where they can actually participate in the advancement of technologies and in the advancement of science and the medical field and engineering and arts and all of these beautiful things. Right now, it's very difficult for them to do so because they simply don't have the resources or the freedoms or the financial means or the security or the safety. It's gonna take a while for these nations to go back to where they were. But I believe it will happen eventually. And hopefully it doesn't happen at the cost of someone else. And hopefully it happens with all of us together. And we finally realize that we're all the same people and we're not actually different. And our skin complexions, different as we may look, we are actually all the same. And realize that there is no specific people who behave a certain way because they are these specific people, because their cultures or religions or traditions. That's never the case. The reality is we as humans behave the way our circumstances allow us or even force us to behave. So if you see that there is a group of people who happen to share the same culture or skin complexion or religion that are all behaving in a certain fashion, it's not because of the traditions and the cultures and the religion and the genetics. It's because the circumstances are forcing their hand to behave a certain way. And if the roles were reversed, so let's say if the Middle East was Europe and Europe was the Middle East, you would surely see the same exact thing happen. And you would surely see that the Middle Easterns are calling the Europeans terrorists, and the Europeans would have the same struggles that the Middle Easterns are now having. And you'll see the proof of that in history, and you'll see a time where there were the dark ages in Europe and there were the golden ages at the same time in the Middle East under the Islamic rule. And this is just one of many, many evidences and proofs that it's not the people, it is the circumstance. And it just so happens now that this area at this current time is going through a very difficult circumstance. And that's not a natural circumstance. It's a circumstance that is dictated by politics, foreign powers, and global power dynamics. So hopefully we can realize that we're all the same and that we would all behave the way other people are behaving if we were in their shoes and if we were in their circumstances. And we stop generalizing and we stop putting people in bubbles and in categories and start actually seeing that we're all actually the same. We're all the same people. And this alienation of each other is not going to get us anywhere. So I want to end this episode on a funny note by sharing a few stories. I was studying in college As soon as I started speaking in Arabic, all of my friends around me would like run away. Like one of them would scream Allah Akbar, and then they would just run away because they just think as soon as I switch to Arabic, I'm in like terrorist mode or some shit like that. It's funny, obviously, like we take it as a joke and I joke with them about these things. And then you see online pranks where someone who's dressed like an Arab and drops their backpack in a public area and then runs away. It's a harmless joke on the surface, but actually it feeds into the stereotype. Like even though we are laughing about it, subconsciously it registers and it reinforces a false image that we already have ingrained in our minds. So even though these things could be funny and could be joking and seemingly harmless, it actually does a lot more damage than you think it does. So we should be very careful about feeding into these stereotypes, especially if they're negative. So try to keep your jokes to yourself, or only do them around people who are a part of the misrepresented group. So if you're around Arabs and you joke about Arabs being terrorists, whatever, that's fine. They're not gonna think about themselves as a terrorist. They don't have that image of themselves. So if you wanna do that, sure. But don't do it around people who most likely have the wrong image. Every time I go to the airport, I wear this Arabic red and white scarf. And every time I go to the airport, I get randomly searched. And the officer pulls me to the side and I'm like, hey, why am I being searched out of all these people? And they're like, oh, it's a random search. Sure, every time I wear this and I'm in a European or like America or Canada or whatever, every time I'm pulled to the side and I'm randomly searched. And I know that it's not random because it happens to my mother, who happens to wear a headscarf, and she always gets pulled to the side and gets searched. It's so consistent, it's almost funny, but I know that it's not. Another story, my wife and I were going from the US to Germany. All of the passengers were German. At the very least, they were all white with blonde hair and blue eyes. It was just me and my wife who have dark hair and brown eyes and dark skin complexion. There was an officer at the end of the tunnel, and everyone who walked, I swear to God, not a single person looked at the officer and acknowledged his existence. I saw the officer, I looked at him, I acknowledged his existence, and I nodded and I said, good morning. And this motherfucker puts his hand out and he does this. So we go over there, he just says, give me your passports. He looks through the pages and he looks at us and looks at the passport and looks at us and looks back at his passport and is looking at both of us and comparing. And he kept us there for like a couple of minutes and then he was like, okay, go. I'm convinced that the only reason he let us go is because we have US passports. And he was like, okay, I guess they're fine. This is one of the very small effects that tarnishing an entire people's reputation, connecting people and religions to labels. And it happens to people from all backgrounds and from all minorities who have been marginalized and stereotyped. So please let me know what you thought about this topic. I know that like if you've made it this far, thank you, because I know this is a very dense topic and I just wanted to make sure that I go over everything that I could think of. So if there's anything that I missed, please let me know in the comments and please feel free to share this video and that's pretty much it. You guys have a wonderful, wonderful day.